You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is David Smith. He's the senior analyst for the Morgan Report, which you can find online at silver-investor.com. Welcome to the show, David.
It's good to be back, Jim.
Well, we thought we'd keep things kind of simple and take a look at some Chinese philosophy that applies today. And of course, you know, we had people like Confucius telling us thousands of years ago, if you want to win, you got to do two things: know yourself well and your opponent. Can you explain, David?
Well, there's a saying in the Chinese history and the martial arts that if you know yourself and your opponent, you will be victorious in 100 battles. If you know only yourself, the odds are even. If you know neither, there is great danger in 100 battles. And I would suggest that this applies equally to the financial realm, which is in many ways, and we've discussed this before, is a type of battlefield of its own between us and our opponents in terms of trying to earn money and keep what we have.
And you're saying, taking a look at that saying, and the banking situation in Cyprus right now, where people are pulling their hair out, they can't get access to their money. It's really taking a lot of the confidence out of the European markets. What happened there, and was this predictable?
I think in a way it was, but people tend to listen to what people say rather than what they do. And if you look at the actions of the IMF, for example, and the European Union principles that were playing around with their money, and the things that have gone on for the last several years in these different countries where they've literally papered over the problems, and I mean that literally and figuratively. They papered it over with paper money that really has no backing or value. This wouldn't have been totally surprising. Admittedly, this was a little different tweak on what had done before. They actually attacked customers' money that were supposedly insured, and now they're backing away from that, but they're going to apparently take a big chunk out of the accounts of people that were above the 100,000 euro limit. But the point is, they've set in train a situation where people should be even less naive than they were before and simply expect what people would behave that are doing these things in ways that accord to their own sense of values or lack thereof and their own self-interest. So these things aren't necessarily conspiracies like some people say, because they're not always hatched in a back room, although sometimes they are. But when these people come out, these dignitaries, and say certain things, ask yourself, does this make sense in relationship to what would be going on if they were pursuing their own interest? Because that's always the case. It's not our interest, it's theirs.
So the banks in Europe are acting on their own self-interest. They couldn't give a hooey about your account or mine.
They really don't. And I'll tell you, over the last week or so, I have come up with a new hero that I really want to pay attention to what this individual says. And his name is Jean-Claude Juncker. He's Luxembourg's prime minister. And this guy speaks the truth. And he's probably no better than the other characters in the play that we're following, but at least he's honest about it. And he made a comment when he was talking about the negotiations that were going on in 2011, mostly behind closed doors, about what to do about the Greek debt. And so apparently what happened is that reporters asked him on a couple of occasions if did he know anything about this? Was anything taking place? Was he involved? And he said, oh, no, I don't know anything about it. I wasn't there. And then finally, about on the third time, somebody commented, well, so-and-so said you were at this meeting and that you were one of the prime individuals that was just talking. And so he finally fessed up and he said, when things get serious, you just have to lie. And you know, I can respect somebody that's doing things that are not in my own self-interest if they're telling the truth. And I gotta have a begrudging respect for this guy because he really is telling the truth.
And he's the prime minister of which country?
Luxembourg.
Oh, that's kind of not much of a country, really, in size.
Well,
but they have a lot of financial impact, don't they?
Well, they do, but I mean, beyond the fact, the point is he's a part of the governing class, and it really doesn't matter whether if he's the prime minister of a tiny country or the president of the United States. They're all operating on the same frequency. The difference between Jean-Claude and other people is that he's able to speak the truth, and the others are unable to do that. And that's important for us to understand as investors, because we have to be able to figure out what they're about, understanding our opponents, and then key back in on our own emotional needs and our own needs of our financial plans, and then we'll have an opportunity on the field of financial battle.
Well, was Jack Nicholson right in the movie A Few Good Men? You can't handle the truth?
A lot of people can't, and if you and I can see the truth and then respond to it, it takes quite a bit of effort, and it takes accepting the fear that goes along with it, and understanding that things are not always as they seem, and watching for what people do rather than what they say. So there were plenty of indications that all was not well in Cyprus, because these bank accounts were something like 8 or 9 times the amount of money of the actual economy of Cyprus, and nobody knew that it was going to play out exactly the way it did. But you have to know that things are not going to have a happy ending, and when you're playing with a bunch of financial elephants and you're a mouse, you have to be careful if you don't want to be stepped on.
You also pointed out, too, the average person in Cyprus, no access to their bank accounts, very limited ATM release of cash. But the big players, the ones who have these accounts with more than 100,000 euros in them, they really weren't hurt at all.
A lot of them, apparently, from the reports we're seeing over the last few days, were able to take out money over the weekend from the very banks that were supposedly had frozen accounts by using subsidiary banks to the tune of billions of euros. So it's pretty interesting how this works out. But you can see the same thing in the United States during the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, where information was being shared by high government officials with Wall Street traders, where they literally in meetings would say the very opposite of what they were going to say later on that day to the public, to us. And so this is just the way it is. And I think if we don't have to be cynical or mean-spirited to realize that politicians, almost without exception, serve their own interest first, last, and always. There are very few Cincinnatus in the world, if you look back at Roman history, where the Cincinnatus, the farmer, crossed the river, saved Rome, and then after the war was over, went back to being a farmer. Most of them aren't this way. And I'll tell you, I've had a quote for a number of years that was said about Boris Yeltsin by a former spokesman. Remember, Boris Yeltsin was the leader of Russia, well, actually under the Soviet Union. He was one of the last leaders and tried to become their top leader. And they said, this spokesman about Boris said the following: power is his ideology, his friend, his concubine, his mistress, his passion. Everything beyond that, beyond the struggle for power, concerns him much less. And so, to me, that encapsulates very accurately and precisely what drives most politicians. They're driven by power. They're not driven by trying to help out the people in their own district, except to get reelected. And they're not there for the children or for anything else that they say. They're there for their own aggrandizement and power, and that's just the way it is.
Well, here in British Columbia, we're seeing the scandal where the Liberal Party, which is formed the government here in British Columbia, has been using taxpayer funds and taxpayer paid people to do things to increase the popularity of the party, which is illegal. And they've been caught with their fingers in the cookie jar several times, and now we have word the RCMP is investigating. So you're right. People, when they're in power, like to do things to stay in power, and if it's dipping into the taxpayers' treasury to do it, they'll do it.
Well, that's just the way it is, and if people are surprised, they just haven't paid attention. But I really do believe that if we kind of figure out what's going on the field, with our opponent, and then stick with that, and don't get carried away by thinking, well, maybe they're really nice people or they have our interest at heart, then we won't be disappointed. And we, as little mice, will not be trampled by the big elephants quite so easily.
Yeah, talk about elephants and mice, the relationship between Canada and the U.S., close friends, the world's biggest trading partners, but they still have to look after, your own stuff first before you start thinking about somebody else's.
Well, that's true. And something else too, I think if you take care of yourself first, and it's not being selfish in the sense of trying to cut somebody out of something, but it's about taking care of your own welfare, of trying to be an independent person and an upright person, and living by good ethics. If you do that, you will engender a respect from others. And if you're the mouse doing that, you'll get a certain begrudging respect from the elephants. And so here's Canada with 1/10 of the population of the United States, and yet massive, massive natural resources and a vibrant economy. And so, I've always, wondered why Canadians so many times feel inferior to the United States, because they really aren't. And they have so much to be proud of and grateful for, and they shouldn't feel that way, but you can't have other people feel differently than they do. But I think that Canadians have many great reasons for not feeling inferior to the United States in any way, shape, or form.
I like to throw out the question, which country has the most foreign investment in the United States? People will come up, they'll say Japan, China, England, Saudi Arabia. What about little old Canada? Because that's the right answer. Well, there you go.
And something like 60 to 70% of all the money that's used in natural resource exploration leading to production comes from Canadian capital. So that alone is fabulous. I mean, Canadians work all over the world looking for minerals and metals and bringing them into production and selling them to larger companies. And I'll tell you, having been to many of these places, some of them pretty remote and pretty unfriendly in terms of the environment and sometimes even the people and often the governments, you really have to handle to Canadian exploration companies. And they've been just hammered into the ground price-wise lately. But I'll tell you something, there are going to be new large fortunes made from those people who can take a well-informed stake in a company, buy their shares after doing the research, and hang on because they're going to be making 2, 3, 5, 10 times their money over the next few years.
You need patience.
You need patience. You need to make informed decisions. You have to understand what you're dealing with in terms of current market situation, and you have to understand yourself so that you don't take a position that's too large, so that you don't get scared out just before you reach the promised land of success.
Well, we'll go from an old Chinese saying to something else that's going to affect China, no doubt. The Daily Telegraph is reporting that Japan has found rare earth deposits deep down on the sea floor. However, they said they can be picked up relatively cheaply because they're in highly concentrated nodules that can be mined without disturbing the sea floor very much. And they believe one ship alone could provide all the rare earths that Japan would need for manufacturing for a year. And they said just having Japan looking after itself in the rare earth market would break China's monopoly on rare earths. And they said the better advantage to the Japanese deposits is there would be no radioactive byproduct released as they pick up these nodules. So
that will certainly be an interesting thing to follow, and we will only know in the fullness of time if that is going to be the case. But that's another thing. I think that for investors, we have to be open to all possibilities. We have to be willing to change our belief structure as new evidence comes in. And that doesn't mean that people dump their rare earth stocks today because of what might happen in Japan. But it does mean, if you're in the rare earth space, that you pay attention and see if maybe, as this thing develops, you would need to rearrange your thinking about that topic.
And maybe Japan is going to become a mining country, which pretty rare there because everything, rare earth. Sorry about the pun, but that's kind of an interesting thing for Japan. They haven't really had a mining or natural resource recovery culture.
Historically, Japan has suffered from being resource poor. They've had to get their resources from elsewhere to produce things, and then they had to go outside for markets too, and that's by virtue of their geography, that has driven them sometimes into warfare, like it did during World War II or before World War II with China. And so now they're having issues again with China, and hopefully they can be resolved without further warfare. But the point being is that Japan needs resources to produce things, and they need markets to sell them to, and that will be a constant with them regardless of how the future plays out.
What about our local gold and silver markets right now? It seems the prices there are kind of churning around the same point right now.
They are, and it's interesting that some of the better silver and gold miners seem to have put in bottom. Some of them are trading substantially above where they were a few weeks ago, and yet, as you mentioned, gold and silver are laboring in sideways motions, and sideways motions can be as damaging to psychology as if things are continuing to go down. So it's really hard to stay the course, but if you have taken your positions carefully and you have some extra cash in case prices drop a lot lower, and you still believe in the scenario that we are still in a bull market, then this is a great opportunity. But nobody said it was going to be easy. But it is a great opportunity nonetheless, as hard situations usually are. Seldom is fortune given to you on a plate. You have to go earn it, and this is one of those times.
Yeah, every time when people say, look at the economy, it's churning along so well, nothing could slow it down or bring it down, and then we have the banking crisis.
Well, we have a situation where most asset classes are rising now because most of the major countries in the world are inflating their currencies to try to prop up asset prices and increase spending and this type of a thing. And it's already starting to result in increased levels of inflation. So very few people understand what really inflation does to their purchasing power. It raises the price of just about everything. And we're going to see how that's going to play out over the next couple of years, with 25% increase in the money supply globally over the last year or so.
Everybody's playing the same game, so they're really not making much of a difference, I think.
Well, it's a game of musical chairs, and when the music slows down or stops, we'll just see who doesn't have a chair.
I guess so. Well, David, thank you very much. Always a great show. My guest has been David Smith, the senior analyst for the Morgan Report, which you find online at silver-investor.com. That's how you can also communicate with David if you like. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, and you can contact us at info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Have a great day.